Good evening, everybody. Give me some thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yeah.
And if you can't hear me at any stage, start waving. Okay, so a little bit on the back foot. I've just got back from a very long bike ride and thrown some tea down my face and had a couple of gins. This is water. And I have a little help from my friend here, Homer, who is actually my role model. Okay, so thermaling. Two parts to it, really. One is how to sort the thermal out when you've got into it. And the other is to find the bloody thing in the first place. If you can't center thermals, then you can't really find thermals because you can't identify them. Because if you can't center them and make a climb, you don't know whether it's a thermal or just a bit of turbulence that's going up or up and down in more or less equal amounts. You just don't know if it's any good. So the first thing to do is to be able to center thermals. I'll spend most of the time talking about that, then we'll see how much time we've got left. We were going to shoot for about 40-45 minutes, and we'll take a poll after that as to whether to carry on or not and see how much we've got through it. It's about 8:10 now. So, centering thermals. British Gliding Association have a very good way of teaching beginners how to center thermals. And it's quite simple. What they say essentially is that, I'm just flicking through diagrams. As the lift improves, and take it off as it reduces. Now, I'd like to, you've disabled the screen sharing, Andrew. I can't share my screen. Can you undisable it? Whilst you're working that out, it's the easiest thing.
You're good now, DG.
Okay, the easiest thing is just to follow the variometer. You should be seeing a little sketch of a variometer needle there, yeah? And I've put the glider on the needle at an angle. Clearly, as the needle goes up, you turn tighter and tighter. If you've got 5 or 6 knots of lift, the glider is vertical, which is what it feels like to a student, someone who's only got 20, 30 hours, when they're turning at 40 degrees of bank, it feels like it's in a vertical bank. So that is a good way of teaching somebody right at the beginning how to center thermals. The only thing you have is the variometer. So this method teaches people to turn very tight when the lift is good. When the lift is not so good, it teaches them to wander around and look for the thermal. Now, how tight do you need to turn? Before we talk about centering the thermal, you need to appreciate the angles of bank. Because if I say turn shallow, turn tight, turn shallow, turn tight, you need to know what those angles are. In order to think about what the angles are, you have to think about the circle sizes, and you have to think about how far you go flying across a thermal. So here's the thing. I'm going to make a fool of myself now. I'm quite used to doing this. I don't have a sailplane, but I do have a Spitfire. So imagine you're flying along in club, standard class glider, you've been cruising around at 70, 75, and you fly into the region of a thermal, you come underneath the cumulus, and you start to slow down. Let's say you come down quite slow to 60, because you really want to stop and climb. At 60 knots, you will cover 100 feet in a second. 100 feet in a second. Now, the thermals aren't very big. If you think about your typical British thermal underneath the typical British cumulus, you know, you hit the thermal and you're flying along and the Vario goes beep, 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 beep. That's in lift for 5-6 seconds. If the thermal cores 5 or 6 seconds across, it's 500 or 600 feet across. If it's 500 or 600 feet across, you have to turn like Billio to stay in it. Let's look at circle sizes. Just share the screen again. You'll notice what I'm doing is I haven't prepared a PowerPoint type presentation because I just hate them. This is just pages from volume 1, diagrams from volume 1. And you should be seeing the circle size diagram. And that shows you that 1,000 feet across, 6 seconds across a thermal, 6 seconds going across the middle of a thermal, you can stay in that. It's a 30-degree bank. A 30-degree bank is about 600 feet across. Therefore, it equates to a 6-second transit across the thermal. But when people are learning to fly, they can't fly at 30 degrees of bank. They can barely fly at 20 degrees of bank. If you fly at 20 degrees of bank, you do a 1,000-foot diameter circle. If you want to climb at 20 degrees of bank, you have to transit a thermal that looks and sounds like this. It's 10 seconds across. So you're flying along at 60 knots. Beep, 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 beep. Beep, 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 that's a 10-second thermal. Now, you do find 10-second thermals. Plenty of them around under thunderstorms and in really good soaring environments in the world. But frankly, not very much in the UK. So look at the circle size graph. That should have it up again. A 10-second transit in lift, you could climb in 20 degrees of bank, but that's not really going to happen. 30 degrees of bank gives you 600 feet across circle. 45 degrees of bank gives you 500 feet across circle. And of course, if you think about the dynamics of circling flight, you can turn tighter and tighter and you basically just disappear up your own rudder shrouds because you won't get much less than about 420, 440 foot of bank. Circle size. That's about the smallest you can fly. Reitman tackled this some time ago because Reitman looked at the profile of lift across a thermal, the contour lines, and there's a graph here of profile across a thermal. And he did the sums for standard size thermals. And he said, turn at 40 degrees of bank. If you turn shallow, you won't stay inside the thermal. If you turn 35 to 45, if you're working those angles, you'll be in ballpark diameters for thermaling in the Northern Hemisphere in temperate conditions. And if you try and turn tighter than about 45 degrees, you're going to fall out of the air and you're going to wear yourself out. It's just too hard. You can do it for a few seconds, but not for long. So to return to this diagram, this is obviously an oversimplification. I like to use rules of thumb, memes, things that have a hook, if you like. And this diagram has a hook. Obviously, you turn tighter, the more the lift goes up. But if you go into it a little bit deeper, what I would say to a student at the early level is when it's good, put it at 45 degrees and climb, 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 climb. When it's not good, wind the bank off. That is a starting point. And I like to use 45 degrees. I like to use 45 degrees because 1, I'm a mountain pilot. 2, I'm a competition pilot. And clearly what I'm doing works without any false modesty. It's working. And 3, it's easy to demonstrate. Wait, 1, I have here one I prepared earlier. Here's one I prepared earlier. You know that the screws are each corner of the instrument. 45 degrees and the screws are lined up with the horizon. Depending on what you're flying, it can be very, very hard to judge the angle of bank. When I was flying the Lebel, I found it extremely hard, and I was generally turning too tight and flying too fast until I worked that out. And I worked it out by booting up my digital horizon and flying to that. So even with 12,000 hours behind me, I couldn't judge 45 degrees of bank. It's actually quite hard to get it really right. If you fly something like a stem, you can't even land the thing straight because the front of the airplane is so curved, you can't even see wings level properly. It's quite a puzzle. Whereas if you've got a Shemps glider, the front of the panel is like that and like that. So you can see the angles. Anyway, that's the starting point. What happens if you use this technique? Well, if you're a beginner, you'll stay up. But you'll probably do something like that. You can see what's happening. The glider turns quite tight in the middle, and then when it comes out, it flies sort of a daisy pattern around the outside of the thermal. This is no good for competition flying. It's no good for performance flying. It's very useful for someone who can't fly, and it's very useful if you're really busy and you just need to hold. You know, maybe you're looking at the map, maybe you're talking to ATC, maybe you're waiting for the start line to open. I should share the screen. That would really help. I keep missing that one. There's your daisy pattern. That's what happens if you relax the bank when you leave the core of the thermal. And if you're a competition pilot, you don't want to be doing that. What you want to be doing is this. There's your beginner's centering technique. Turn hard, open up, turn hard. But if you want to climb better, you need to turn hard in the sink as well. This is counterintuitive, but it really works. You can see that on that diagram there, that the gray dotted line is the flight path entering thermal. Then the black line is turning hard at 45 degrees. And you can see that the glider is turning hard as it leaves the lift. If you think about it, where do you want to be? You want to be in the middle of the thermal. How does opening out the bank as you leave the lift keep you near the core of the thermal? Well, the reason for opening out the bank as you leave the lift, if you're a beginner, is you have no idea, right? You have no idea. So what you're doing as you leave the core is you go, right, well, I'll just fly around with a shallow bank on and I'll wander around until I happen to bump into the thermal again, and then I'll turn tight. And that's good enough for a beginner. That works. But now you should be aware that you're leaving the core of the thermal. You keep the bank on hard. This is difficult to do. What happens when you leave the core of the thermal? The speed goes down. As the glider hits sink, the speed reduces. If you're turning your 45-degree absolutely optimum, you know, with the minimum sink for that circling radius, if you're right on it, right in the groove, God, I don't know what that was. Somebody dropped a tray of beer glasses by the sound of things. If you're right on it, right in the groove, and you fall off the core of the thermal, it's very hard to keep the angle of bank constant and not over pull. If you pull too hard, the glider will go off the step if you like. It'll fall off its step. It'll go high drag and sink. Now, I fly an ASW 24, and my teammates are flying LS7s. And both of those types are absolutely famous for falling off the step. If you pull too hard, you generate a lot of sink if you pull too hard. and then you have to catch the airplane. So as the energy goes away, it takes a lot of fiddling to keep the glider flying nicely as you leave the core of the thermal and still pulling. If you have to do anything, don't let the nose go down. If the energy goes away too much, just roll off the bank a fraction to keep it flying, to keep it efficient. If you put the nose down to keep the speed right, then you've got the nose down and a tight bank, and you've rather buggered yourself up, because you've got to pull it hard back into the thermal, and the bank is tight. So that's a high drag maneuver. Diving with a lot of bank and pulling up again doesn't really help. It's a bit like putting the nose down at the end of an approach when you're slow, and you say to the student, "Oh, you're a bit slow," and he sticks the stick forward. No, I didn't want that. Same sort of problem. So you hang on to the tight turn. The next question is, when do you relax the turn to move further into the core of the thermal? The variometer is later than you think it is. The variometer is, if you have a total energy variometer, which everybody flies on now, the total energy variometer is extremely gust sensitive. It registers speed as well as height. If the speed increases without a commensurate dive, then the vario will go up. If the speed decreases without a commensurate climb, then the vario will go down. You probably won't notice the downs very much because you're not interested in the downs, you're looking for the ups, but you will notice the ups. And what happens, you hit a bump, the glider goes, ba-dum, and when the glider goes, da-dum, the vario goes, straight away, ba-dum, instantaneous, absolutely instantaneous, or as close to. The reason for that is all you've done is you've flown into a differently moving parcel of air. The speed of flow at the total energy head has increased. The suction has increased. The pressure has dropped. The vario responds pretty much instantly. There's a little lag in the instrument, but if you've got an electric vario, especially if you've got a pressure transducer vario, it's close to instant. It's as instant as you want it to be. You know, I run my ClearNav vario on 0.7 of a second delay. The filtering algorithm is really good, so you can run it fast, but you still get gusts. So that gives you the impression that the vario is quick. You know, you go bang, quick vario, right? Wrong. When you fly into vertically moving air, before the vario can register the energy, the glider has to change its flight path. It has to start rising up. So you know what it feels like. You fly into vertically moving air and the glider starts to accelerate upwards. And it has to travel upwards through a certain height to generate a pressure difference. 1 millibar per 30 feet. 1 millibar is 1,000th of atmospheric pressure. I think 1 bar is about 15 psi, isn't it? So it's 1,000th of 15 psi. It takes almost nothing to drive the vario, but you've got to go some distance. And in the time it takes to go some distance to drive the vario, there's your time lag. So if you hit a bump on the edge of the thermal, it goes boom. But if you fly into the core, the glider goes accelerate up, beep, 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 beep. So you feel the thermal before you hear the vario. Now, if you're trying to center on the variometer, the time lag is a bitch. You should have that one. Follow the vario and you'll move too late, yeah? My Adobe is trying to update, would you believe it? Okay, so gray flight path is the original circle. What we've done is open out the turn and fly towards the lift. We've opened up the turn as the vario goes up. Look at the result. You fly through the core and out the other side. Turning too shallow is the #1 mistake I see. The number two mistake I see is people opening up the turn too late. This guy's just flown straight through the core of the thermal and out the other side because he was following the Vario. And following the Vario, you will be too late. Remember, the circle is, the thermal is maybe 6 seconds across in a straight line at 60 knots. 7 seconds across if you're flying dead straight at 55, you know? Not very big. So that doesn't work. What about going on the sensations? Three glider paths in this diagram. Andrew, you got the three glider paths? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, okay, just checking, because of course there's no monitor for this that I've got it working. The glider on the right, as he comes into the thermal, he's crossing those contour lines. Initially, he's crossing those contour lines at a right angle. Has the best chance of feeling the lift, a good chance. He registers there's lift, he opens up, the thermal is still outside his circle. So that's no use at all. The one in the middle, the grey path, which is the middle of the three, same problem. As he straightens up, in that turn, as he straightens up, the thermal core might just lie a little bit to his right. But he's too far over. If he flies up the gradient, he's going to miss the thermal again. He's going to go through the core and out the other side. The left-hand flight path is the only one where opening out and flying up the gradient towards the lift is going to work. He happens to be in a position where that actually works. But that's why it doesn't work every time. You do it, it doesn't work every time. It's not a great way to center, even though that's what a lot of people will do. So the Swallow Challenge in South Africa, where you coach, I was coaching, you go to a fantastic game lodge, the sort of place I'd never be able to afford to go, and you work with the South African team and the squad and 4 or 5 current world champions. So there am I giving these briefings to people. Anyway, so I do this briefing, and then I say at the end of it, I say to the guys, I say to the team and the world champions, what do you think? Am I on the right lines? And they go, yeah, that's more or less right, G. Yeah, that makes sense. Except for Sebastian Kawa. And Sebastian says, gee, you've got to talk about moving away from sync. And I talked it through with him. And I went back to the books, as it were, and reworked the thought process. You see, if you open up on the Vario, you're late. If you open up on feel, it's unreliable because the thermal core could still lie outside of your circle, even when you're tracking a shallow bank. It's quite possible it's outside your circle. In other words, the bias is that it's late again. You turn hard through the sink, you open up as you come into the lift, and you're late again. You've opened up too late, flown across the core, flown out the other side. Back on the share screen. So what Sebastian said was you have to fly away from sync. And there's 2 reasons this works. One is, if you're on the edge of a thermal and you do one turn and you fly really into proper sync, you do not want to go there again. You just don't. You don't want to be there. You might flow into a different piece of sync, but flying a second circle through the same piece of sync is a no-brainer, beginner's stupid mistake. It's shooting yourself in the foot. Why would you do it? So you come through a patch of sync. As you leave the sync, you know the thermal is somewhere over there ahead of you, sort of. So you open out and you fly sort of straight for a couple of seconds and you don't go back into that piece of sync. You might find the thermal, you might not. But also, if you look at when the flight path is opened up, if you open up the flight path as you leave the sync, not as you start to come into reasonable lift and feel the gradient of reasonable lift and feel the flying uphill, but as you come out of the sync, if you open up the flight path then, you're opening up the flight path earlier and you have a much better chance of running into the right part of the thermal. So you can go back to following the Vario. In this diagram here, opening up as you come into the lift is going to take you through the core of the thermal and out the other side. It's too late. You have to anticipate that, which means you can't follow the Vario. Using your sense of acceleration, it is biased towards being too late, effectively too late. This glider on the right that I've got the cursor on, this glider needed to open up here. This glider needed to open up, oh, stop doing that. This glider needed to open up here. And if this glider opens up about here, it'll have about the right effect. In other words, you open up as you come out of the sink and start to go up in lift, but it's earlier than you think if you want to be reliable. Now, there's one more way of looking at this, and it's another conceptual way of doing it. When you're circling in a thermal, you're trying to find the core, right? Now, the last place you want to be is in the middle of the thermal. Remember, if the thermal's like 6 or 7 seconds across, it's a 30-degree bank across. You're going to turn at 45 degrees. If you're in the middle of the thermal, the next thing that's going to happen is you will fly out of it. You've got to fly around the middle of the thermal, not in the middle of the thermal. You can't be in the middle of the thermal. If you're in the middle of the thermal, you're going to come careering out of it. You've got to go around it. So when you're thinking of centering, all the clues you have, let's say you fly up the gradient. If you're flying up the slope of the thermal, you're feeling the acceleration, then the best acceleration comes when you're pointing straight at the middle of the thermal. You don't want to be in the middle of the thermal. You want to go around it. So if you're turning right, for instance, if you have a sense now that the thermal's core is dead ahead of you, you're too late. You needed to have a sense maybe 30 or 40 degrees back round the turn that the thermal core lay at your 1 or 2 o'clock, because you want to fly around it. You need to fly towards it, but leaving it off to one side and then tighten up so you fly around it. That is not the same as going to the middle of the thermal. Think of an eclipse. Think of a lunar, think of a solar eclipse. Think of the moon crossing the sun. I've got an eclipse here. Wait one. Wait one. I have an eclipse right here. Okay, so there's 2 circles here. One is the thermal core and one is your glider circle. If you imagine, you have to move so they're concentric. And that doesn't mean if the glider is here coming around the turn, right on the 12 o'clock position, if the glider's on the 12 o'clock position, the core of the thermal is to his right. The glider's flying around, he's coming left to right on the 12 o'clock position. The core of the thermal is the middle of this circle. So he's got to translate the aircraft along in that direction, not in that direction, to make the circles concentric. You need to reframe the problem to be good at this. You need to change the way you think about it. And of course, what most of us do when we're actually good at this, we know where the thermal is and you just fly around the core. And if you look at this flight path, share screen again. If you look at that flight path, you can see the so I hope that makes you think hard.
Gee, I think we just missed that last 20 seconds or so. I think, as you were showing the diagram, I think your voice froze.
Did I trip out? Okay, so I'll go through it again. Hopefully you're on this time. I'm on this time. When you know what you're doing, you just fly into the core. You fly around the core. You just go, oh, the core's over there. I'll just go over there. If you're completely current and you're doing, if you've done 100 hours in the last 6 weeks, it isn't hard. You just fly around the core. The birds manage it, for heaven's sake. Have you seen the size of the brain of something like a kite? It's like a pea, and they manage. So yeah, it's just practice. This glider here in this diagram has moved his circle so it is now concentric with the core. And when he was moving, that is the dotted line, he is not pointing at the core of the thermal. So that's food for thought, I hope. Right, so that's one part of the talk. What's the time? It's 20:40. We've done half an hour on that. Does anybody want to raise some questions? I'll pull up the chat window. Any advice for a standard label and what's the speed to thermal? Yeah, just under 50 knots, probably. How to center thermals using rudder aileron. Well, okay, so how you handle a glider in a thermal. If you're at a shallow bank, you can't slow down too much. When you're turning shallow, the glider has a propensity to sink in bumps, and if you get a bit too slow. There's quite a lot of extra sink rate available before it quits flying. If you're flying in a tight turn, 40, 45 degrees of bank, the stall comes much closer to the speed that you're flying at. The sink rate goes up, yeah, but it's compensated for by a much tighter turn. Effectively, when you're turning tight, you turn near the stall. When you're turning shallow, you turn well away from the stall. That's one thing. So in the ASW24, I wouldn't fly slower than 48 knots, and I'd fly up to about 55 knots dry in a tight turn. In the standard label, actually pretty much the same numbers, because the standard label, despite the fact it's delightful to fly, isn't a great climber in the pure aerodynamic sense. You can get it up thermals quickly because you can feel, but the wing root junction is horrible, and the wing profile, the wing planform is pretty crap. I should know, I've owned 3 of them, love them. So somewhere between about 48 and 55 if you're flying an unloaded standard type glider. The trick is, do not horse the nose up and down to try and chase the speed. You must not have the nose going up and down. You must put the nose in the right attitude and keep it there. If you have the nose going up and down, you cannot feel the accelerations that the thermal will give you. You know, the thermal will push you up and it'll let you down. If you're pitching, and if you're sort of pitching, or if you're sort of lurching around the thermal, those of you that fly with students know exactly what I mean. The glider goes around the thermal, so it goes, yeah. It's a bit like young Frankenstein, you know, wasn't a hump on the other side? I mean, it feels like that, lurching across the sky. And if you're flying like that, you can't possibly feel the thermal. It's as an aside, it's worth bearing this in mind. It's another meme. If you went for a drive on the track with a racing driver or with a rally driver driving at race speed, you would be astonished at how well that person can drive. It doesn't tend to show up so much when you're hanging around glider pilots to know what they're doing. You know, if you're hanging around a gliding club, you know, I hang around a Mariner and there's Terry Delore flies out of the Mariner, one of the best pilots in the world, Justin Wills, Gavin Wills, all thoroughly brilliant sailplane pilots. But you don't fly with them. You know, you might follow them around the sky, but you don't fly with them. And it's not like watching somebody banging a ball around a squash court or watching a rally driver go around a corner sideways. You can't really see what they're doing. But actually, those people, the really good glider pilots, have phenomenally good handling skills in thermals. In thermals. They can grind the glider around, and at the same time, they can feel what the air's doing. And, you know, the 5,000 hour pilot's going to beat the 500 hour pilot just about every time. Handling skill is super important. Okay, right, we were going to move on to the other part of the chat, which was how you find thermals. So, yeah, how do you find thermals? It's a whole nother briefing looking at clouds and looking at the structure of thermals coming up underneath clouds. It's a whole nother briefing, but we'll touch on it. The way to find thermals on a blue day or a day with clouds is to understand how the damn things work. So step one is that the air hits the ground. I'm just looking for useful diagrams. Step one is that the sun heats the ground. The air mass in the lower levels is transparent to the energy that's going to make thermals. Solar energy, most of solar energy gets stopped at the top of the atmosphere. It turns it into ionized plasma, and you lose a lot of radiation into the top of the atmosphere. The top of the atmosphere is super energetic, but of course it's not warm because there's hardly any molecules to warm you up, but it's very energetic up there. And that stops a lot of the radiation. What you see and what you feel in terms of sunshine is the band of wavelengths, the energy that the atmosphere is transparent to. That heats you up and it heats the ground up. Yes, clouds will stop that energy to some extent. Of course, a cloud is not gas. A cloud is liquid water hanging in the air in suspension. Hundreds, millions of tons of water hanging over our heads. It doesn't fall on us because it's very, 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 very small drops, right? I know it's crazy, but that's the truth. It doesn't fall on us because it's lots of very, very small drops, but it's hundreds of thousands of tons. Anyway, so the cloud stops the sun, but otherwise the sun comes down, it hits the ground, and the ground warms up and it re-radiates the heat, and it re-radiates the heat at different wavelengths. It re-radiates at wavelengths that the air can absorb. The air is not transparent to the infrared radiation that comes off the ground. Now, this is super important. The air has to warm up. When it warms up, then you get this thing that the molecules jiggle around faster. A unit volume of air takes a bigger volume of air, bigger volume, it becomes buoyant, and away it goes. But we know how thermals work. It takes some time for that energy to transfer itself into the air and for the air to warm up and to become buoyant. It takes some time. It's not an instantaneous process. So here's the thing. The angle of the ground to the sun controls how much heat the ground absorbs. If it's sloping towards the sun, you know, maybe you got the sun here and the sun beating down on the ground, it absorbs more energy than if it's flat, and a lot more energy than if it's facing away from the sun. This becomes very important in the mountains, but it's important even in hilly areas. So slopes that face the sun get more insolation, they absorb more energy. Dark colors tend to absorb more energy. Anything that's wet, well, it'll absorb the energy like Billy O, but what happens to the energy? It works to evaporate the moisture. Now, I know some people say that moist air is more buoyant than dry air, and there is something in that. But in almost all circumstances, the cooling effect of evaporation reduces the strength of the thermals more than any water pumped into the air by evaporation increases the strength. There are some circumstances where you get moist hot thermals. I'm thinking about the very shallow lakes in Australia, lakes that are a foot deep, and they get really hot and they produce stonking thermals. But generally, anything that's moist, verdant, green, growing, properly growing, kills the thermals. It tries to kill the thermals anyway. So you have a certain pattern, if you like, of colors and shapes on the ground that work. One of the very big things about thermal formation is the movement of the air over the ground. If you have, say, a good thermal source, let's say a ploughed, dry, brown field. A ploughed field works better than a harrowed field, probably because it's got more surface area to absorb and release the heat. Think lungs, tennis courts, yeah? More surface area, more gas exchange, lungs. More surface area in a ploughed field, more heat exchange. Think of a radiator. I know they make radiators flat, but it's a terrible shape for a radiator. A radiator, think of a car radiator, yeah? So a not smooth surface, a dark surface, something dry. Scrub is good if it's dry, you know, dry, dead scrub, dead crops, you know, ripe crops that don't have any water in them anymore, ripe fields of wheat, dry, fine. But a big controller of thermal energy being released from the ground is the wind on the ground. Have to visualize this. When the wind flows across the ground, let's say you have 15 knots of wind blowing across the ground. It's never smooth. It's always tumbling like that because it gets dragged back by friction. So the air moves and it does that. It moves and it does that. So you've constantly got movement. You know what it's like landing on a bumpy day, windy day. It's all over the place, isn't it? When the air is going across the ground in those vortices, in that turbulent flow, it lifts the air away from the heat source. So it mixes the heat energy through a moderate layer before the thermal can get going. It increases the heat exchange, but it mixes the thermal before it can get going. So one of the very strong predictors of where thermals come from is the calm bits on the ground, where there's no wind. And Reichmann said this years and years ago. He said you need to take a walk. He's flying in Germany, we're flying in England. The temperatures, dynamics are the same. Take your shoes off, wear shorts and a t-shirt, go for a walk. And just imagine doing that when you're in the cockpit. You look down and you look at the ground and you imagine yourself walking along the surface. Where is it going to be cold and windy? Where is it going to be cold and calm but out of the sun? Where is it going to be warm and in the sun and not windy? Where would you sit and have a picnic? Where would you take the girlfriend for a bit of nookie? Where's it warm? Where's it cold? You know where it's warm and cold on the ground and where the wind is because you spent a lifetime there. So that's a powerful technique. It doesn't work in Australia and it doesn't work in the high desert in the US because, you know, you look out the glider and you go, oh, where's it warm? Everywhere. In fact, there's no part of that ground I'd put my bare feet on without burning my feet. So where do we go now? And when you're spotting thermals, let's say you're flying out in Benalla, when you're spotting thermals, you do it slightly differently. You don't ask yourself, where is it warm? You look more for triggers. Anyway, so one question you can ask yourself is, where is it warm? And that will help you spot the wind shadow areas as well as the areas that are producing some insolation. let's share the screen again. You should have a wind shadow thermal source there. We got Andrew? Yep. Okay. So there's a couple drawn on this picture. You can see where the sun is. The sun is shining down onto the left-hand side of those slopes. Those slopes are out of the wind and they're going to produce thermals. This is just absolutely typical on a blue day. If you've got a northerly wind and a southerly sun, the wind shadow thermal source thing works a treat. It works on a bigger scale when you're flying in the mountains. The lee side of ridges works really well. I'm very keen on the whole wind shadow thermal source thing. Anyway, okay, so you need a thermal source, you need hot air. If you have a particular hot spot, it might trigger a thermal. I'm going to make a fool of myself again. Stop share. So the thermal starts to form and it hits air at 1 and a bit kilos per cubic meter, right? It's a lot of cubic meters. 80,000 tons of air moving around. The best part of the thermal is somewhat smaller, but the whole package of a British standard thermal, which is 1/2 mile deep and 1/4 mile across, 80,000 tons of air. The bit in the middle, which you want to stay in, isn't 80,000 tons, but the whole thing's. So here's the thermal getting up and going. It takes time to accelerate that away from the ground, and it can't go up flat. The thermal can't go up like this. It has to go up as a, as a teardrop. Think of the shape of the spaceships in E. Doc Smith's Lensman series. If any of you read that, they're all teardrops. All the fast ones are teardrops. The thermal goes up as a teardrop. And that means it has to do a considerable amount of moving and gathering and getting its shit together before it goes up. That takes time. That is the cycle time of the thermal. The thermal can be shaped by a particular hotspot, which is what I've drawn there. That helps trigger the thermal. Once the thermal's starting to move upwards in one place, it encourages the other bits of warm air to move in and follow up through that little puncture in inertia, and away it goes. So you look for hotspots. A header in a field. Sorry, I'm not in the southern hemisphere. A combine harvester in a field. Yeah, what we call a header. When it's cutting the crop, if the dust is going up, it's producing a thermal. That's the hotspot that's kicking off the thermal. It's probably sucking the heat out of the crop as it cuts it. A bonfire will produce a thermal. Even a bonfire can trigger a thermal. Any little hotspot. Just south of Benalla, there's a wood pulp factory. You just come off tow over there and climb away every time. So, so we've talked about that. But here's the thing. Share screen again. We've talked about where the thermals come from. But you've got to know where to put the glider to find it. And in order to know where to put the glider to find it, you've got to know two things. You've got to know how strong, well, three things. You've got to know how strong the wind is. You've got to know how fast the thermal is likely to be going up. And you need to know the direction of the wind. I've deliberately put the icon of the glider in this picture is clearly sniffing downwind of that thermal source. But you've got to know what the angle is. Now, I don't have the diagrams that I really want. That is one of the diagrams that I really want. I haven't drawn the thermal source there. I've just drawn the motion of the bubble coming up and away from the ground. But if you think about what's going on here, over a period of time, this single thermal is occupying those three places on the diagram. This is a period of maybe 3 or 4 minutes. So the wind from left to right, it's only a two-dimensional diagram, but obviously it has a particular direction the wind is flowing in. This volume of the sky that I'm tracing out with the cursor, this volume of the sky is a volume within which you would be advised to fly if you want to pick out a thermal that's coming from a thermal source here. I call them smoke signal thermals. If you're flying on a blue day, the thermals are almost always what I call smoke signal thermals. By smoke signal, imagine your typical, your caricature of a North American Indian with a blanket and a fire going blanket, 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 puff, blanket, 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 puff, blanket, 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 puff. So you have bubble, 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 bubble. Smoke signal thermals. If you're looking for thermals on a blue day, that's the way you're looking for them. So downwind of the thermal source, you would expect to find a short street of thermals. I don't think I've got the diagrams that you need in this book. Just wait one. Bear with me. This is one of those instances where doing a little bit more preparation would have been useful. Okay. So you should have a diagram of the thermal bubble rising and forming cloud. You haven't. Share screen. Thank you, Andrew. There you go. So there's a little cloud on the top of this smoke signal thermal, but it's produced by the same method. There's a thermal source down to the left of the picture, and it's producing bubble after bubble after bubble. Now, just imagine what happens if you fly from right to left through here. Right to left. You'll hit 3 thermal cores. The one on the right, the core is higher up. It's further up away from the ground. The one on the far left is newer and it's closer. The nature of those thermal cores will be different as you run through them. They'll feel different. It's a little short street that you might run running into the wind. And typically, bear in mind this is a repeated thermal bubble. I'm going to stop the share. Whilst I talk, you'll find that as you cut into the street, you'll intersect a volume of air which has been affected by thermals passing through it, and it isn't moving as fast in the wind as the air around it. It's a plume. Now, it's not a column, it's a plume. That's a better diagram still. That's the one I want. So as you fly, say, from right to left in this diagram, and if you're thinking about blue thermals, just take the clouds away because it really doesn't make much difference to this particular structure. You'll intercept a street of thermals and you'll fly up the street of thermals. As you come into the street, the glider will shiver and bounce around about a bit. This volume in the sky, it's the shape of, it's kind of like the shape of a ram's horn. I don't have a ram's horn, but if you can imagine a ram's horn stuck in the ground, it's like round, and it's stuck in the ground and it tapers to a point. If you can visualize that in this diagram, the volume of sky where the thermals are coming up, that is your volume of, that's your target rich area. That's the volume where you might hit a thermal. So there's individual thermal bubbles going up there. And when you enter that volume, you're quite likely to feel a bump. You see, in that volume, in that ram's horn of air, if there's any wind, which there is obviously clear, you look in the diagram, the thermals drag at the wind. The thermals don't move at the speed of the wind. 80,000 tons of air is not going to accelerate to go downwind at 10, 15 knots really quickly. It takes a while. There's a reason it's called the mixing layer. It's called the mixing layer because it mixes the temperature profile and it mixes the wind speed up through the thermal layer during the day. But the thermals coming off the ground, they drag at the wind. When you enter this plume of thermals, the speed will jump about and you'll get a bang. Now, you know what that's like. You're flying along, you're heading for a thermal source, you look down, you go, oh, well, that header in the field, and I think, and you come downwind of it and it goes, and you chase it up the wind, and then you might find a core. You feel the turbulence associated with convection before you necessarily feel the lift. And part of that turbulence is the drag on the air of the thermal sticking to the ground and not moving as fast as the air mass. That is important. When you fly on a blue day, the first climb you leave, look at the drift. Use your moving map to look at the circling drift. You know, the glider goes. When you leave, fly up the drift line. Fly straight into wind. See if there is any handedness to the sky. Work out the wind direction. Work out the wind direction relative to the legs. When I'm pointing at the turning point, when I leave a thermal line, point at the turning point, I always know, I make sure I know which way the wind is in relation to where I'm pointed. Always. It's really vital. On a blue day, it's critical. So having described that system, we're talking about how you find blue thermals. There's your short street of blue thermals entering the street and finding it. That's if it's streeting. So let's see if I can, oh, sorry, let's just share the screen. God, I keep forgetting to do that. Right, there's your short street of blue thermals, blah, blah, blah. Now what I need to do is to find the diagram of patterns in the sky. And we're talking smoke signal thermals, so I'm not looking at the cloud-driven thermals at the moment. So here's a trigger edge and lines of thermal coming off it. These are little short streets. These are little smoke signal thermals. Pop, pop. The thermal triggers when it goes from warm to cold. Here's another trigger edge. The thermal triggers when it goes from warm to cold. This is when I jumped out my glider at Cambridge in 2012, I was doing just this. This was Newmarket. And this was the Gallops just downwind of Newmarket. And I was trying to get thermals coming off the back end of the town. Warm and dry to cold and wet. And that day was extraordinary because all the fields were wet and not working and all the towns and roads were. So that's why we were all in exactly the same place doing exactly the same thing at 2,000 feet. Great. Anyway, little short streets. I'm just looking for another diagram. Wait one. This is what I wanted. So this is really to close the little bit of the briefing on how you find thermals in the blue. You go to thermal sources. You look for thermal sources. You do that little mental walk on the ground. You look for hot spots. You look for spots that are out of the wind. You visualize the thermals coming off. The thermals will drift downwind a little bit. Sometimes in the left hand of the diagram, you get little short streets. If you get little short streets in the blue, you don't tend to get long streets in the blue, but you can get little short streets in the blue. I know you can get very long streets in the blue, but that's a different situation. Smoke signal thermals give you short streets. The way to fly is if you're in sync or neutral air, you go across the wind. When you run into lift, you fly up and down the wind. Because the greatest chance of finding the thermal is up and down the wind. The shorter the streets get, the less and less that tactic is viable. Sometimes there are no streets. Maybe the wind's not very strong. Maybe something else is destroying the streeting pattern, like a wave over the top will destroy the streeting pattern. You might get streets crosswind. If there's no handedness to the sky in terms of probability, if you can't find streets, then you just fly to the thermal source. And if you can't fly to the thermal source, you fly straight down track and hope to bang into something. The Australians do this on the right. They do this a very great deal. And I'm pretty convinced that they do this because, one, they have a great depth of convection, so you've got a good chance of finding another thermal. And two, they're very often flying in a situation where there's shear and wave above the thermal layer. Because of the nature of Australia, there's nothing sticking into the sky. So the air does this at night. It stratifies and separates because it's not going over any mountains. Ugh, no mountains there. If you've got northwesterly at Narromine, there isn't a mountain for, I don't know, 5,000 kilometers, 10,000 kilometers. There's nothing. So the air is like that, and that lends itself to wave once the thermals start coming up and pushing into the stronger flows. And the wave does that, and it destroys any streeting, because if the thermal's doing that and the wave goes down behind the thermal, then you don't get a street. Australian conditions, quite often you don't get streets. European conditions, quite often you do get streets. You don't tend to get so much wave-driven, shear-driven wave in Europe as you do in Australia. So in Australia, you tend to do this, in Europe, you tend to do this a bit more. I learned to my cost not to do this very much in Australia, except when I knew that it was working like that. You have to find out. So that's a little bit of information on how to find blue thermals. All I've done really is to snatch at just a few ideas out of the material, if you like, in terms of finding thermals, because there's a hell of a lot to talk about. But that particular thing, blue day, work out whether it's windy or not, work out whether there's an asymmetry to the sky, whether there are short streets or it's just single thermals. And using that, then you have a better chance of reading the ground and putting yourself in the right place. One more thing about finding blue thermals. You can arrive over the thermal source in the right place, and you can be below the bubble, you can be in the bubble, or you can be above the bubble. You cannot control that. No amount of skill can control that. With clouds, you can control it because you can see the age of the cloud. If the cloud is new, the bubble goes lower. If the cloud is old, then most of the bubble's inside the cloud. But with blue conditions, all you can see is the thermal source. So it's entirely a roll of the dice. It is very easy to think, well, that was stupid. When you go to a thermal source and the glider goes da-da-da-da-da, and you do a circle and it's like half a knot. That's a hit. It's not a miss. It's not a mistake. The thermal's above you or below you, but there's no way to know whether what's going to happen there. There's no way to know. There's no way to control it. There's no way to know. What you did was you went to the right place. You just got there at the wrong time. You have to go on, go find another one. When you're flying in blue soaring conditions, it is very easy to convince yourself that you're being a numpty and going to the wrong places, or you've got really unlucky, and then to get really uptight, and then for your flying to go off. So watch out for that. It is a game of chance. I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat for questions. Whoops. Just wait one. Can I explain how the cold trigger works in sparking off thermals? Yeah. When the air is cold, if air that is warm moves across a cold surface, the cold surface will have cold air above it, and the air that is warm flows above the cold air. And that, it triggers it. It flicks it upwards. You get the same phenomenon underneath streets with cloud shadow. You get the same phenomenon with sea breezes. Cold air chisels the thermal into rising away from the ground. The thermal doesn't want to be against the cold surface and the cold air. It's lighter than the cold air, so it has to move up. And the cold air stays on the ground and the warm air flows over it and starts to moving. Tom, you couldn't see the demonstration. No, you've got that now. I have G's book, highly recommended. Yes, I'd recommend that. Okay, somebody asked about reading clouds, and that really is a whole nother talk. So I don't want to get into that right now. And Mike Hayes said, I have a bit of a flap phobia. I get better climbs with 0, +2, +4. Do we have a rule of thumb setting for your 45-degree bank? Well, yeah. I don't pull on flap until I pull the stick back in the turn. So I roll into the turn, put the stick in the middle, reduce the rudder, and then pull the stick back to load the wing and tighten the turn. And I pull the flap back when I pull the stick back. I'm flying, well, I used to fly Janus. I've flown the Arcus a bit. I did a lot in the Janus. And now I'm flying an Ash 25. And I've flown quite a few flap gliders. Generally, if you're turning really, really super hard and you want the very, very smallest circle, then you pull on all the thermal flap, you know, whatever stages of thermal flap it's got. The Ash has got 2 stages of thermal flap, flap 4, flap 5. If I'm turning really, really hard and I want to core that thermal, it's a small circle and I'm trying to go as slow as I can in it, I'll pull 5 in. And the glider's really clumsy to fly like that. It's easier in flap 4. If I forget to put it in flap 4, if I try and thermal in the normal cruising setting, you know, the sort of 60-knot straight line setting, I keep looking down and finding I'm doing 60+ knots. I'm going too fast. So it is worth using the flaps. Mike, I don't know what Mike is flying.
It's a Vega at the moment. It used to be a pick, but they both behave very much the same.
Yeah, the Vega's got a funny wing section, hasn't it? Very pointy leading edge. But the racing Vega was a bloody good airplane. It let down a bit by the manufacturer quality, but it's a good old airframe. It flies really nice. Yeah, I'd use a bit of flap, not a whole lot, but I'd certainly use a bit. I get better climbs with +2, +4. Sorry, how many degrees?
Yeah.
Oh, look, it depends on the wing section. What have you got available?
Well, +4, +8, +12. Which one would you pick? Well,
I'd probably most of the time be going around at +4.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, G. That's great.
Once you get it really draggy, it's absolutely great if you're completely right in the right place, but you can't. It's kind of too clumsy to move around like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Just dodgy to move around.
Okay.
All right, well, we've talked for an hour. Andrew, where do you want to take us?
I just asked a question on there, G. Could you tell us about your latest book?
Oh, yeah.
Don't forget to tell us about that.
Soaring Engine, Volume 3. So, those of you who haven't come across them, Volume 1, well, you've just seen a lot of diagrams and pages from Volume 3 and from Volume 1. I can kill Volume 1 and give you some idea of what Volume 3 is about. It's about high performance soaring. Let's share the screen. Volume 3, high performance soaring. This is the table of contents. So essentially we cover the theory behind making the glider go, which is speed flying theory.
Share the screen, G.
Oh, for God's sake, I've got it up, but I haven't shared it. Duh. Thank you. Let's start again. Volume 3, high performance soaring. There's a table of contents. Speed flying theory. In flying, we cover that essentially the maths and engineering, if you like, behind making the glider go. How does the glider work in the sky to go fast? What are the parameters? And I'm not into the aerodynamics, I'm into the using it. So we do McCready theory. McCready theory is much maligned and only poorly understood by a lot of pilots. So I really wanted to go through that. And you can see the various bits of McCready that we're covering. And not many people, for instance, have heard about the problem of kinky polar curves, because we do have kinky polar curves. Right, then we cover sports psychology, which I've called thinking. Conventional sports psychology doesn't really cover gliding very well. Gliding is a probability sport, and it's also kind of threatening to your safety if you get it wrong. So like climbing or cave diving, you know, if it starts going to worms, then the arousal level jumps up really hard. And that's pretty well understood. But what isn't understood is how we deal with probability-based decisions when we're under pressure. There's a whole load of literature about that, and it needs to be studied. Training yourself. If you do the human factors and you look at the McCready theory and you give yourself some rules of thumb and you understand how the brain works, well, then you can put it together and start working out how to coach yourself, how to train yourself and coach yourself. And there's some ideas there. And then I've written some ideas about competition flying, you know, how you deal with competition flying. And to give you an idea of what it looks like, I'm quite pleased with the diagrams. I'd finally being able to draw diagrams that are fairly expressive, so you can see, you get some idea of what's going on here. I was especially pleased with that one. Threshold 4 knots. Anyway, that gives you an idea what volume 3 is about. The first two, the first one is about soaring in flatland, ridge, thermal, and doing it in the mountains. Ridge and thermal in the mountains. And that's what I want. The first one's about ridge and thermal flying and flying in environments like this, but also flying in the mountains. The second one's about convergence flying and wave flying and how you do those things and how you understand them. And this one is about basically how you become a good glider pilot. It's got nothing to do with the lift. Very little to do with how the lift works at all, but everything to do with how you manage the glider. And those will be available from Nav Boys in the very near future. They're going to arrive, I hope, at the end of this week. And one of the whole points of doing this, one of the points of doing this talk was to be able to publicize the book. So thanks for reminding me, Andrew. I am a particularly forgetful person. I think it's the Alzheimer's kicking in. All right, well, I think I'm done. I hope that was useful to you.
That's absolutely brilliant, G. Thank you so much. Thank you on behalf of Staffordshire Gliding Club, and obviously thanks to everyone who's joined us from all over the world. Literally, I think we've had New Zealand, Canada, I believe, all over the world, as well as obviously lots of members from the BGA and the UK. So thanks to everyone who's joined us, and thanks to G for giving us a great talk. I think I spent a fantastic week down at Denby with you. I had a whole week of these talks. Can you believe it? No, if we weren't in the air, then we had the G's lectures in the morning. So it's brilliant, really highly recommended. And yeah, a massive thank you from us at Staffordshire for taking the time, G, to chat to everyone. And thank you very much indeed, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for coming. And I'm finding this lockdown period particularly useful, actually, because I kind of want to shift from sitting in the back of a glider and doing one-on-one stuff, which is great fun, but it means I don't get to fly very much. I kind of want to shift away from that instructing role and more into a coaching role, where I talk to people and sort of encourage them to find their own way forward with a bit of information, more coaching than instructing. And this, I've been doing a few Zoom calls and a few Zoom lectures. It seems to be a way forward to talk to people online and to have material that helps. Anyway, if any of you want to email me, you can look at the Soaring Engine website has a mail link. And if you go on the Soaring Engine, just Google the Soaring Engine, you'll find the mail link there, and you can mail me and have personal conversations if that's what you need. All right, enjoy, and jolly good night. I'm going to pour myself a big gin now. Well, another big gin.
From the Booker Gliding Club. Thank you very much indeed from the Booker Gliding Club. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Andrew, for organising. It takes a lot of organising, so thanks, mate. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks, Andrew. And thanks for chasing me up. Like I say, I just got off the bike, so I was a little bit on the back foot tonight.
I think it was brilliant, G. Absolutely brilliant.
Good.
A true performer.
Yeah, well, I've spent many a happy hour when it's not soarable. I mean, my first gig was essentially national coach for the BGA. And, you know, I used to go to gliding clubs and it would rain for a week. So what do? You know, you get a whiteboard and you keep people entertained. John Williamson taught me how to do that. John Williamson was a master. I so miss him. Right. Okay, toodaloo, then I'm going to say good night. Thank you very much.
Everyone, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob.
Cheers, G.
Thank you.